Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our final Writing the Wrongs in Archival Description webinar, Setting and Applying New Standards for Descriptive Language with Sarah Morin from the Connecticut State Library. I'm Kathy Crogwell-Varda, the Director of Conservation Connection. We're so delighted to have all of you here this morning. I hope you've been able to participate in our other two webinars that we've already had in October. If you missed any of our webinars, they are posted on the Conservation Connection website. All that information will be provided for you at the end of Sarah's presentation, so you'll have all the links that you need. I'd like to turn it over right now to introduce our state archivist for Connecticut, Lizette Pelletier, give you a warm welcome from the State Historical Records Advisory Board.
Forgot to unmute. So thank you, everyone. For those of you that this is your third time around, thank you very much for doing the whole series. And for those of you who haven't been at any of the either of the other series, just a little bit about SHRAB. We are a 19-member board that represents records creators, records managers, people who care for them, custodians, researchers, genealogists, and anyone else who is seeking information. And also half of our membership must also be practicing archivists. We are people who care deeply about the preservation of Connecticut's historical records. And part of our advocacy for preservation is educational programs such as this for staff and volunteers at these types of repositories. The board serves as peer reviewers for the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, which provided funding for this series. And the staff uses board's evaluations on its recommendations for grants applications to the board. And the NHPRC Records Grant Program established the the SHRAB boards during the United States Bicentennial to save and make accessible documents necessary for preserving democratic rights, and as well to promote the preservation and use of documentary heritage. And so I'm glad you're here, and I hope you learned a lot from this series.
Thank you, Lizette. I'd like to take this moment to introduce you to our speaker today, Sarah Morin. She is the project archivist at the Connecticut State Archives, where she works on the National Historical Publication and Records Commission, NHPRC, grant project, Uncovering New Haven. As project archivist, she processes New Haven County and Superior Court records from 1666 to 1855, identifies cases involving African American, Black, and Indigenous people and groups, and creates finding aids and online subject guides, including using inclusive, conscientious, and reparative archival description. Previous to this project, she processed institutional and manuscript collections at the Connecticut State Library, the University of Connecticut, and 2 historical societies in Massachusetts. She received her master's degree in library and information science with a concentration in archival management from Simmons University in January 2019. Before transitioning to the archive field, she worked for 15 years in donor relations at college universities. If you have any questions for Sarah at any point during her presentation, please put it in the chat. If you could start it with a question mark, that helps us make sure we find it right away. And now I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Kathy. I want to thank both Kathy and Lizette for inviting me to be a part of this webinar series.
Oh, hold on. Sarah, you got muted.
I thought I unmuted myself.
There you go. That's
all right,
okay.
I'll start again. All right, I wanted to thank Kathy and Lizette for inviting me to be part of this series, and I wanted to thank everyone for attending today on this fine Monday morning. Next slide, to my presentation, setting and applying new standards for descriptive language. So I just wanted to, I know Kathy had read a little bit about me, but I just wanted to briefly touch on a few things here to explain how it has shaped me into the archivist I am today, and it will also be relevant to the kinds of work that I am doing here. As Kathy said, I'm the project archivist for the Uncovering New Haven project. I have been working in this position since December 2020. Previous to this project, as well as other archival projects, I spent 15 years in donor relations for colleges and universities. So what this entailed was also, in addition to donor relations, I also did marketing and communications for fundraising purposes, which included grant writing and other things, as well as building relationships with various groups. And I also prepared pieces for, you know, how everybody gets the donor magazine from their alma maters. I worked on pieces for that as well. So I did various types of writing and outreach for this. And previous to obtaining my degree in library and information science, I had a Bachelor of Arts in Professional and Technical Writing from the University of Hartford. So I had started out doing that. And I bring all of these elements and the lessons I've learned over the course of my career in writing and marketing, communications, donor relations, archives, and libraries to my work on this project. Because in addition to doing this reparative archiving, we are also trying to do outreach to make the community aware of these resources and that it's something that people can come and use for research and other things. So as Kathy said, I'm working on the Uncovering New Haven project. We're preserving and enhancing access to New Haven County and Superior Court records from 1666 to 1855. And a major component of that is to identify and digitize court cases involving Black, Indigenous, and people of color, both persons and groups. We're also creating an online index of such cases that people can view and search. It will be part of the finding aid once that is prepared. We are scanning BIPOC cases and other cases of selected research interest to the Connecticut Digital Archive. So this could involve other marginalized groups, women, people in poverty. So all kinds of different cases that we have identified as of being regional or national research interest. This project was initially funded by the National Historical Public Records Commission, and after that funding ended, the Connecticut State Library has generously given us 2 years of funding after that to make sure that we finish this project. And another aspect I'm going to talk about is the social media publicity and outreach. But first, before we talk about that, I'm going to talk about how we handle terminology usage in these court records. So given that we are processing court records from previous eras, where accepted terminology for peoples and groups was much different than it is today, we formed an advisory committee to consult with regarding terminology usage and the way we talk about these records and the people who are involved in them. The advisory committee consists of staff from the state archives and the state library, representatives from the State Department of Education and the Connecticut History Day program, teachers, professors, researchers, scholars, historians, and community members. We were seeking people of diverse backgrounds and perspectives. Counting library staff, we have about 15 members, so it is a bit on the larger side. We developed a terminology policy with their input, and this policy is on our subject guide, which is included in our resources list. So I'm gonna touch on the major points of it. So depending on the context, we are using the terms African American, African descended, or Black to describe peoples whose ancestry is African. And as a counterpart, or if you are a person of English descent, we are saying Anglo descended, because we are trying to get away from default and other. We're trying to balance. And so when I talk about context here, say I'm dealing with a court record from 1715 and it involves a person whose ancestry is African. We can't use African American because America did not exist as a country at that time. So we use African descended. Now, after the revolution, we will use both African American or Black because we recognize that people may prefer one term or the other. So, or maybe both, it depends. And For our next one, if we're speaking generally or other information is unavailable, we are using the terms indigenous to describe peoples whose ancestry is Native American. The speaker mentioned last week in her presentation that indigenous is a broader it's a broader term. It can apply to people who are indigenous to any nation. Native American is somewhat more problematic because of the connotations of and connection to colonialism. So if tribal information is available, which unfortunately in the court records it is not because the court clerks did not prioritize this information, we will prioritize it if we can find it. I attended an excellent webinar in June 2021 called Indigenizing Historical Narratives, and one of the speakers was Chris Newell. He was the executive director and senior partner to the Wabanaki Nations for the Abbey Museum in Moniscatic Bar Harbor, Maine, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced any of that. And he is also a member of the Passamaquoddy people. And he stated, whenever possible, identify tribes by their names because they're multiple cultures, different languages, and ways of living. And the idea of generalizing an umbrella terminology is an English language concept. So, for example, I wanted to give a related example of how we are trying to get away from that kind of thinking when we are applying to other cultures and nations. I mentioned earlier that we are making an online index of cases involving BIPOC persons and groups. So many people of African and indigenous descent do not fit into the first name, last name format that those of English and European descent do. So our index must allow for that. So what the courts did at the time is they would assign a last name with an ethnic identifier. So like if someone's name was John, they would call him John Indian. So these names were not chosen by the people themselves. So we are not assigning that just so they can fit into that format. However, if the courts assigned it, we will put that was assigned there because we are trying to be accurate as well as balance that with being conscientious. We do not want to assign that. So moving on to our next point on the slide. We use the terms enslaved person or enslaved people, enslaver, captive persons or captor to describe people in cases involving the institution of slavery. This point is not here, but it's related. We use freedom seeker or escapee to describe enslaved people who have absconded from their enslavers or captors. As George Orwell, the author of 1984, noted, language shapes thought. You can feel the difference between the terms slave and enslaved person. Another example is poor versus impoverished person. One term reduces a person to the sum of their circumstances. The other reminds us of their humanity. And it's very good to reinforce that even when you're informally taking notes, because it really starts down to the smallest thing that you do to help reinforce what you are trying to do. However, on the other hand, we do use the term slavery and slave trade to refer to the institution itself because we do not want to sugarcoat the brutality that these institutions inflicted on people. Slavery was a dehumanizing and inhumane institution that should not be controversial in 2024, and we should not soften that. If there is a need to quote directly from the court records for the purposes of accuracy, we will put the archaic and offensive descriptive terms in quotes. We do this to make the difference between us as an institution and the record itself speaking. So we're trying to differentiate and saying, this is the record speaking versus this is us speaking about the record. So it's like these little things, and you can do this in all your communications. You can do this even if you're making personal notes. And this is where the sort of change comes, is that just reframing the way you think about subjects and the way you talk about them, even the way you write about them, whether you're writing for yourself or writing for an audience. We include disclaimer language in our finding aids, database indexes, and social media posts where appropriate, stating that these court records contain archaic descriptive terms for ancestral, racial, ethnic, and gender identity that may be offensive or harmful to individuals investigating these records. And I know there is debate about content warnings, but I personally believe it is doing a kindness to warn people what to expect so they can prepare themselves emotionally. And I'll give you an example. I was watching a documentary on the Hartford Circus fire recently. It was about 20 years old. It was on public television. They did not include a disclaimer, but they showed morgue photos of some of the deceased children. I would have appreciated a warning just to prepare myself for that, or maybe I would decide, hey, I can't handle this today. So I think it is doing a kindness. So some key takeaways for me while I was going through the process of developing this terminology policy with the input of the advisory committee, as well as Lizette and other staff at the library. One of the first things I learned, there is often no one size fits all term for a single group. And I know people want that term, they want that certainty, but it's just not there. And I know that there was some discussion about this in previous weeks, about there's even disagreement within groups, or people want to be called, some people want to be called this, some people want to be called another term. For example, I am aware there is a debate in between terms like Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Latine. So I think we need to be comfortable with the complexity, inconsistency, and ambiguity, which is challenging if you are a cataloger and you're trying to catalog things. So my philosophy is the more the merrier, since not everyone in a group agrees on terminology. If specific terms can't be identified, or you need to be speaking in a general sense, be as inclusive as possible. So for example, an earlier example, I use both Black and African American to make sure, and this can evolve as I might become aware of more terms. So if we evolve, we can make sure that we are including everybody. And some people have mentioned these following resources that we have also used to help develop this policy: the Diversity Style Guide, which is excellent. It gives the history of a term, whether it is appropriate for modern usage, what the history of the usage was, as well as the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia anti-racist description resources. Those are in the resource list that I will be handing out today with this presentation, and I know it's been in others as well. It's been in other presenters have. So we have used those two as a starting point for handling description in finding aids, database indexes, and social media posts for the Uncovering New Haven project. So several members of our advisory committee also suggested we refine the terminology policy on an ongoing basis to reflect people's self-identification as determined. And of course, this policy is subject to change and expansion as we learn more about the needs and preferences of our diverse audiences. Because unfortunately, the sad fact is terms sometimes become weaponized, they fall out of favor, and we need to be able to grow and adapt to these changes. So I'm going to talk about some of our publicity methods and goals. In this field, it is very much incumbent upon us to make our audiences and the public aware of what we have so that our resources can be used. And so another major component of this project is publicizing these records and connecting them to the communities. The original metric of the grant was to make one social media post a month. So that was our baseline. So I took that and I developed a social media plan. And it's not as fancy as it sounds. It's very it's like you start with one thing you consistently do, and then you build on that slowly. So it can be as little as one social media post a month. So where I started is, first, I compiled resources and created a subject guide. So this will help investigators put these records into context. We are also very careful to note that some of these resources may have been written in previous eras, they may have disclaimers, so that doesn't necessarily mean we endorse them. We just want to make people aware of what's out there. So that after we created the subject guide, I established a blog, and I do one post a month on that, which we promote with teasers on Facebook and Twitter, or X as it is now called. And after a year of doing this consistently, we added an Instagram component. We post there 1 to 2 times a month, depending on how much we have in the records that we would like to share. So it's very important to start small. Do something, build from there, do something small. The keys are sustainability and consistency. And then as time allows, I also write articles for third-party publications, and I give presentations on the project. So in the blog and the Instagram posts, my goal is to decenter the English colonial voice of the court records and focus on what can we tell about marginalized persons and groups of all kinds, which include BIPOC, women, Irish, immigrants. We see a lot of cases involving their impoverished people, disabled people. We want to portray their experiences with as much honesty, compassion, dignity, and humanity as we can. And this requires questioning our own assumptions and biases, which we all have. And there was a previous presenter who said it's exhausting, but it's worthwhile. And as I said earlier, I think about the way I write things, even down to jotting down notes on a Post-it note. And the more you kind of do this, the more it becomes second nature. And it's like you're building a muscle. So the more you do this, it's the more you get used to it and the more flexible and adaptable you can become. So our goal is to also highlight with this blog areas of potential interest to researchers and investigators through subject posts like Women in Colonial Connecticut, Disease in Colonial Connecticut, Loyalists in Connecticut, Divorce, Inquests, which are investigations into unusual or untimely deaths. And the goal of our posts is to begin a conversation, not to be the final word on it. So Kiera Singleton, who's the executive director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Massachusetts, gave a talk called Northern Slavery and the Preservation of Memory through the Connecticut League of History Organizations in June 2021. And what she said really stuck with me, and I want to share this because it was just so good. She advocated for memory institutions to portray history with honesty, sensitivity, and as completely as possible. She said it was important to read against the grain of colonial records, for example, estate inventories that list the names of enslaved persons. But we need to remember these records were not created for the marginalized. They cannot tell us about their internal lives or their experiences of being enslaved, but it is still important to tell what we know, even if it is just a sentence. It's also important to remember that, and Chris Newell said this in his presentation, Black and Indigenous history is not only about conquest, slavery, and genocide. Their story is not just of labor, but also resistance. So where possible, we need to show how people maintained the cultures of their homelands, how they spent their leisure time, how they created a new culture and privacy and community for themselves. And we have found court cases of men and women demonstrating this kind of resistance, and I'm going to share 3 of them with you now. So our first case of resistance is Phyllis of New Haven. And this is notable because this is the first case that we discovered in the New Haven County Court records with an African-American or Black plaintiff. Sorry about that. In 1765, Phyllis, a free woman of New Haven, sued John Clark of Colchester for assault and false imprisonment. She alleged that Clark, with force and arms, made an assault on the body of herself, then being in the peace of God and the king. Furthermore, she declared that he did unlawfully make and her imprison and restrain of her lawful liberty against her mind and will. And he hath ever since with the same force, and still doth most unjustly imprison her and restrain her of her lawful liberty, to her grievous injury. So this was a case of probably attempted illegal enslavement, which you saw a lot in the years leading up to the revolution and afterward. In recompense for these offenses, she sought 200 pounds in damages, and Clark failed to show up for trial. And in one of the more satisfying resolutions I've seen in these records, the court awarded her full damages plus her court costs. Our second case of resistance is Cubitt Freeman. In March 1711, Barnabas Baldwin of Milford sued Cubitt Freeman. He was also known as Cubitt Carby or Cubitt Carib, and described in the court papers as an Indian of Milford. So because of his name Carib, one wonders if he is from the indigenous nations of the area, or if he was from the West Indies. So he could potentially have had African ancestry and indigenous or African. So we're not sure, because again, you see how the way that the court clerks recorded it, it's very hard for us to determine because of what they prioritized. Per the writ that was issued by Samuel Eels, Baldwin sought from Freeman debt due by book, the sum of £2. However, Freeman never responded to this court summons. On the day of the trial, he, being called 3 times, appeared not, this court being informed that he is out of this government. So he clearly fled to a place where the English did not have jurisdiction over. And the court did decree that he was to pay the sum of £1 and 14 shillings and 11 pence to Baldwin. We do not know if he ever paid this debt or if he suffered any penalty for not doing so. And our third case of resistance is Mehitable Whitehead, an English descended woman. In 1716, Micah Palmer of Brantford sued her for slander, and she also lived in Brantford. He claimed that she falsely accused him of abusing his role as the administrator of an estate. And she was saying to others that he had committed such underhanded cheating tricks and had many times feathered his nest with such tricks. So not only did Mehitable not back down from these words, she issued a written rebuttal to the court, and which is pictured here, requesting that the charges be dismissed. And she argued that he did wittingly and willingly cheat her and feather his nest with the money. And the written rebuttal is particularly amazing here because historians estimate that female literacy rates were 40 to 45% during the 18th century as compared to 80+% for men. And this information is from Nancy F. Cott's The Bonds of Womanhood. And not only did Mehitable Whitehead win this case, Palmer had to pay her court costs. It was very common if you lost a case, the court would rule that you had to pay the other party's costs. So in the resource list for this presentation, I have included links to the blog posts that discuss these cases further, and I have also included links to the case documents themselves, which have been digitized in their entirety, and they are currently available in the Connecticut Digital Archive. So I just want to share some things that I have learned and continue to learn as I am engaged, or as I am doing publicity, social media, and other outreach for this project. One is basically just a basic writing tip. Always know who your primary audience is and communicate your message to them as effectively as possible. And you might be, well, the general public is my audience. But the general public in, say, Connecticut might be different demographics, different interests than the general public of California. So there's always things to consider. So for example, as you'll see in this slide, there is an image of a cat and a chicken. These were created for a presentation geared towards 6th to 12th graders, and they have since become sort of our unofficial mascots. And we've named the cat Jelly Bean and the chicken Cluckers. So that was one thing we did to kind of gear it to a younger audience, especially since the court records are quite esoteric and can be difficult to access due to the handwritten and the brittleness of the paper. Another thing to remember is, where possible, and I see this in findings all the time, we want to use the direct voice, not the passive voice. So for example, direct voice is a beaver ate the log. Passive voice is a log was eaten by the beaver. So you see how it takes a longer time to go through that. So I see this all the time, especially when it comes to decisions made by organizations. I think Kathy had mentioned one of our finding aids earlier that had to do with Indigenous organizations and treatment and things like that. There was a lot of, I've seen it, there's a lot of passive voice saying, like, you know, it was decided that X, Y, Z. Well, who decided that? So we want to make sure that we are using the directness and saying, this is who decided, like XYZ decided that, you know, we were going to do this. We also want to make sure we're not describing, we want to acknowledge the brutality of injustice and dehumanization, but we don't want to describe the violence in a way that is insensitive or sensationalistic. So no clickbait, no clickbait. There are ways to discuss very heavy, weighty subjects, and yeah, you don't want to sound like, say, Cafe Mom or something like that. We want to be kind and not condescending when warning people of broadly sensitive topics. For example, we don't need to warn for less common phobias or triggers unless your specific target audience is likely to have them. We want to be careful when we are censoring terms because done in the wrong way, it can be a form of erasure. For example, place name changes. If a place name has a slur in it because it was named after a group of people, when we change the place name, we want to still acknowledge the history, and a way to do that is to talk to the community. We want to talk to the community, get the consensus. And then in another case is, I'm sure everybody remembers when Pearl Milling Company sold Aunt Jemima maple syrup. And then after that, and it's understandable why they wanted to change that, but then there were articles about people who were like, my ancestor played that role. She took great pride in it. So it's complicated. The question we want to ask ourselves is, how can we name or rename something in a way that honors the history without being derogatory? And I think sometimes we rush to be like, oh, we got to fix this. We got to fix this. But we got to talk to people. We can't just make the mistake on the opposite end, which is, again, not listening to the community, not hearing and recognizing that people in the community are going to have different opinions, and that's okay. We just want to find a way that, we want to find a compromise that, and that shows that we're trying to build consensus, build relationships, and try to do that. And yeah, it's a messy process, but it's very worthwhile. Censorship of certain terms can hinder people. So this is more if you're posting on social media, less for finding aids and things. There are people who try to actively filter out certain information because they don't want to read it, and that's fair. However, there are some platforms, which I'm sure we're all aware, that you are not allowed to say certain words anymore. So you just have to be mindful of whatever platform you're on, if you're allowed to say those words. Like, for example, unalive is a pretty big substitute now for suicide and things like that. Grape for sexual assault. So one thing to do is, if you are on platforms publicizing things, be aware of their rules. Find a different way than using those terms. So it's it's a balance. If you're publicizing this, find a way to do it that isn't this. So another thing you'll want to consider is the timeline of your postings. As archivists, we're dealing with sensitive subjects and dark subjects. There may be some other sensitive things going on right now. For example, I mentioned that we've done blog posts about inquests. We were going to publish this in October 2023. That was when the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip happened. So that was all over the news. It was not a good time to publish something about something very dark. So what we did is we actually waited. We posted it on Halloween. So we tied it to a cultural event where it was welcome to discuss such things. So you want to consider proximity as well. Sometimes proximity, even if your intentions are not such, sometimes proximity is something to consider. So a couple of things to just be prepared for is, first, strong emotional reactions and exhaustion. It gets very exhausting when you read court case after court case over and over again, and you see what people had to go through, how people were oppressed, and it can be very demoralizing. So make sure to decompress, practice good self-care. On the other end of the scale, and I feel like we may not talk about this enough, but it is something to watch for. Be careful you don't become too desensitized. It's very easy when you're reading the same term over and over again, your brain starts to get used to it. So you want to make sure that you are, reminding yourself, so that you don't accidentally say the term when you don't want to. Also be careful where and when you engage in dark humor, which is a coping mechanism. But it may not be appropriate or wanted. So a good way of countering this is check in with trusted colleagues, check in with friends and family periodically to gauge where you are, just to sort of gauge where you are and make sure that you haven't gone too far one way or the other. So what are some of the feedback and reactions that we have gotten to some of our posts? Fortunately, we've had largely positive feedback on our blog and other social media. Interest in the court records is looking at the metrics of who's looking at our subject guide and blog, and it seems to have significantly increased. We get many patron requests. I monitor our stats and I report on them monthly just so we can see what's going on. And we've also gotten a lot of no news is good news, and that can be the case as well. There was one incident where we had negative feedback. It was a great learning experience. So And I learned something I did not know. So I learned about the peril of using female as a noun on the internet. As a writer, I try to vary, sorry, that's our doorbell. I try to vary my words to avoid repetition. And as a woman, I use woman and female as a noun interchangeably. I did this in an Instagram post about women in colonial Connecticut, and I received this comment. Can we please not use females as a noun in the same sentence as men? The misogyny is showing. So when I post under the state library account, it doesn't show who the author is. So they didn't know who the author was. They didn't know a single thing about me. And I didn't know this was a concern. So I did some research. I Googled, I asked around. No one I have asked around was aware of this, but on the internet, it's a big deal in certain communities, particularly Reddit. Basically, it turns out, so what happened was, as I was doing this research, someone else commented and asked, why is this an issue? And so the person gave the response, female is an adjective, counterpart to which is male. It's using appropriate terms for men while using dehumanizing terms for women, as if we're plants to be identified solely by reproductive organs. You can also look at who uses females as a noun. Most of the time, they're MRA, which stands for men's rights activists, red pill, incel types. So these are all largely internet subcultures. They know the word women, but would rather use terms that distance us as humans and make it easier to speak to and about us as if we're a whole different species. So I let this percolate for a week or so as I considered, how should I respond, or should I even respond? Admittedly, I was upset by this comment and I took it a bit too personally because I felt attacked. And I needed to cool down and figure out, what do I want to do? How do I want to handle this? And it was so interesting because I was so afraid that I was going to use the wrong term elsewhere. It ended up being something, it's always what you least expect. You can't prepare for everything. But yeah, this person, they didn't know who I was, what I believed in, or what I was trying to do. And it felt like an attack on that, even if that wasn't the intention. And it's difficult to read tone over the internet. Now, if I was not a woman, I would have educated myself, apologized, and pledged to be more aware of this issue in the future. But as a woman, I personally, now this is just my personal opinion, I don't see a linguistic or an etymological difference in between the two terms. It didn't make logical sense for me that one term's okay, the other's a slur. That said, these are context specific. They don't have to make sense. Context matters. Words can be easily weaponized. Another thing is, I personally dislike the idea of ceding a descriptive term to a group that would use it against me. But that said, I need to respect other women feel differently. Now, if I was not a member of this group, if I was not a woman or a female, it would not be my place to do this kind of reclaiming, personal or otherwise. And this is something we all have to decide for ourselves. So after a week, I responded under my own account, not the state library, because this is not their fight. I said, my name is Sarah Morin, and I want to let you know that I wrote this post. I am a woman, and I certainly do not ascribe to MRA, red pill, or incel beliefs. I personally choose to use both woman and female interchangeably as nouns to describe myself and when speaking of my gender in general. I respect your choice not to use female as a noun as a description for yourself. And there was no response, received no response. So make of that what you will. So lessons learned from this and other social media posts and other things. We don't always know what people will find offensive. We cannot always predict what is going to upset someone, especially online. What we can do is we don't have to live in fear. We can listen, we can learn. I find that if your intentions are good and you go into it with a humble attitude and you're willing to learn, people are going to respond to that. So if you are willing to reflect and learn from the incident, even if you're part of the group, because there are schisms, as I mentioned earlier, there's a big schism between people who prefer Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine. I know of different people who use all of them. And I also know of people who can't stand some of the terms. So again, we want to make sure that, we can all reflect, even if we're part of the group. I do take more care to pair male and female and man and woman, and I did edit the post a little bit just to try to address that. So That doesn't mean a response is always warranted, but I'm glad that I did in this instance. If you feel a response is warranted, you can also check in with other people, sounding board, things like that. Communicate your position with compassion and respect. If the person is engaging in good faith, you might come away from the discussion for the better and having learned from each other. If the person is engaging in bad faith, this is the internet after all. If they're trolling, if you're spoiling for a fight, they will look elsewhere for the argument or in the bad feelings they're trying to provoke. And sometimes something is clearly bad faith or it's clearly insulting, and it's not worth trying to respond to that. So, and now we come to the end of my presentation. I would be glad to answer any questions or elaborate further on any aspects of reparative archival description or social media and publicity that I outlined here. So yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was absolutely fabulous. Really enjoyed learning so much about the process. I think we look at a revised finding aid, but you've really shown how much thought and care goes into these and why we're always worried. And one of the things that came out in the registration is time. How much time does it take to do this work? How much should we budget for? So I think you laid this out really, really well. We do have a question in the chat, and then we have some comments that you might want to chime in on too.
Okay.
So Black Archives asks the question, the focus of this webinar has been on BIPOC terms. Has anyone, especially you, changed terminology, for example, for disabled people with mental or physical disabilities? Or had you had to change terms related to job titles or any other types of identity?
Yes. I mean, the reason mine is so focused is because that's the main focus of the project. We do come across, there are some very offensive terms for people that were used, like, for example, the term idiot. So we haven't seen, it was often hidden in the records, but I would recommend, if that was more of a focus, figuring out what are these terms that were used and what are the terms that we can think of to use instead. Like, for example, I touched upon this. You want to basically make sure you're not reducing the person to the sum of their disability, and just using, like with female, using as an adjective, using the disability as an adjective and not a noun. So that's one way I would recommend doing that, and not reducing the person to the sum of their circumstances. So we have seen a little of that. We also have cases where people have applied for conservatorship, or the courts have looked for conservatives for people who were deemed not able to manage their own affairs. So that is a whole other area in the court records that people could delve into as well. But yeah, I would recommend using kind of the same caution and compassion in terms of addressing that. So yeah, I would, we have not specifically added anything to our policy because we don't see it as often, but that's definitely something I'm going to write that down and I'm going to think more about. So I thank you for raising that question.
Lizette, did you want to say a little bit? You made a really interesting comment about being sensitive to what staff members would be comfortable working on. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So one of the things that is getting discussed in the archival profession over the course of the last couple of years is, we've talked about warnings or descriptor identifications for things that could traumatize users, but we don't often think about the staff that are working in the collections. The best example I can give you is a colleague of mine had to work on a collection from an animal control officer in another state, but because they investigate animal abuse cases, and often criminal investigations involve photographs, there were a lot of photographs that this person had to look at to process the collection that were just horrible treatment and abuse of animals. And it was a fairly large collection. So she was advocating, and there was no policy in her institution about saying, okay, I only can look at this so many hours a day, or this is so traumatizing to me, I cannot work on this collection. So, just thinking on the flip side of, you know, being sensitive to the public and what they're seeing in the collections and giving them notice what may be coming so they can decide whether they want to look at something or not. Um, we should be sensitive, especially if we have volunteers working for us. Yeah, that you know, that they don't have to look at this collection. You know, even if when it first comes in, if making a notation so that someone 2 or 3 years from now who's going into process collection, if you know there's something in there, provide a warning or a heads up or whatever.
Yep. I do that with all the students that I supervise. I warn them. A lot of them find it fascinating. Guess some people are a different breed when it comes to this. Some of us find it fascinating, but some of it is horrible. As a volunteer, I process things like letters to the new town B about after Sandy Hook. That was very hard. Letters from Michael Ross, who was the last man to be executed in our state. He was a serial killer. Those were very hard to read. So some of this stuff is, and then, yeah, it's just a lot of processing. So I try to warn students. I do warn them, and I say, let me know if you have any. And I personally have things that I have mentioned when I was a volunteer, and now that I'm like, I couldn't process. Like we have certain records that I'm like, I know I couldn't process. So I've mentioned that. So that's an excellent point, Lizette. And I kind of wish I'd added a section on that as well. But I'm glad you brought it up. Because yeah, another thing is knowing your boundaries. What someone else might find macabre or fascinating, somebody else will be very traumatized by, and it's important to give that warning to the people working on the collections and being like, look, you don't have to. And I also urge my students, I'm like, go home, watch something fun and fluffy. And yeah, my students are like, oh yeah, I do. Go home, because some of it is we've come across some very, very harsh things. So yeah, it's definitely and I feel, especially for people in related fields, archaeologists who find things as well. And it would be good to know if there were any. I think I've heard of some webinars and stuff like, how do you deal with this? And I think it should actually be in library curriculums dealing with traumatizing material so that we can prepare. And again, disclaimers, we can prepare ourselves as much as we can. So yeah, thank you, Lizette, very much.
And I'm just going to take a minute to direct everybody to the chat because there's actually some really good conversation about things in collections that can be upsetting and how to handle them. And one of the examples by Sally Lafreni, if I pronounced your name correctly, the Ingenium Science and Tech Museum in Canada has a system for helping their staff navigate triggers in their work, and has a system of labeling items that might require the user or employee or researcher to practice care. If you can, Sally, if you can share that link with all of us, that would be fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
Avianca has posted a question. In your work, have you come across anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic language?
What's interesting is that we have not. I know of one man in the court records who was Jewish. He was a Sephardic Jew. I think a lot of times Judaism was very hidden. So there's a lot of times where stuff is very hidden. And what he had done is he had converted to Anglicanism, and before he moved over to New Haven. So I think a lot of time I would not be surprised if I did, just in the way that things are talked. But I think a lot of times, especially in the records I'm working on, it was very, very much Anglo descended. Everybody was othered, even if you were French or Dutch or German. It was a very, very heavily English descended mindset in here. So I think pretty much it was either hidden, or they would call attention to the fact that somebody was not us, basically. So you can definitely see that in the court records. And he is the only person, and the only reason I was aware of that, of his background, was because I had done research. His son was a noted loyalist, and I had done research, I had done research on a court case involving him, not for loyalism, but this was before he was apprenticed to, I want to say, a tailor. And he committed the crime that was considered a crime back then, fornication. He contacted a venereal disease, and this rendered him unable to work. So the person who he had been apprenticed to sued his father, basically saying, your son did not fulfill this because he was a minor. And so I was doing research on that as part of my Diseases in Connecticut blog series, and it turned out that yes, he ended up the father ended up arguing that he was not bound jointly and severally so basically he got off on a technicality. He basically said, I was not there, I did not agree to this, even though his son was a minor. So the court ruled in his favor. His son eventually grew up, married a woman, ended up becoming a loyalist. He ended up fleeing to Canada. He is very well noted and remembered in Canada, in New Brunswick. And then that's how I ended up finding out information. So I would not have known that if I had not done background research. So there are some groups that we do not see at all in the court records, and I'm sure people were there. We just didn't see them because the way things were described in the records. So we don't see a lot of it. We don't see a lot of, I wouldn't be surprised, but I have not seen any to date.
Terrific. Thank you. If there are no other questions, just to wrap things up, again, thank you, Sarah, so much for a really terrific presentation today. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and conversations in the chat. I think that adds so much to any webinar. Again, you will be getting an evaluation for Sarah's presentation today. This is the end of our 3-part series, but we are looking for funding to continue the series, hopefully in another year or two. So if you have questions, suggestions, recommendations, please feel free to send them my way. The video hopefully will go up today, if not tomorrow, on both the Conservation Connection webpage, which is CT Conservation Connection at ct.org, or the Google Classroom. Thank you all so much for being part of this series. We really loved having you and getting to see people from so many different places. And hope you have a terrific rest of your week. Thank you.
I would just like to say thank you to Amherst Williams and the Connecticut League of Museums for their assistance with the registration process and other things as part of this.
Thanks to Schwab for putting it on. We're always happy to collaborate, and I appreciate that, Lizette. Lizette, Kathy, everyone here. This has been a great series. And Sarah, I was so pleased to see our speakers from the Keynotes of Change series had such an influence on your work. So that makes me feel great. There's no better thank you.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm always trying to attend webinars and listen and learn to just make sure that, we're continuing to describe our records in a conscientious way, in a respectful, compassionate way. So.
Thank you, everybody.